Hi, my name is Peter Budreo. I was for many years the general manager of South Lake Community Futures. I'm a resident of East Gwillimbury, and I got involved with the GTTI project literally from the very, very earliest stages of sort of the first meeting of a steering committee. And from there, got on the board of directors, was on the board, I think, for about 10 years before I finally ran out of all sorts of eligibilities, and I was getting ready to retire anyway. So I ended up leaving the board of directors at that point in time.
How did you become a founding member at GTTI?
I got involved as literally from square one with the first meeting of the steering committee. For the next years, went through that whole process. Beyond Jerry, I was one of the sort of next principal drivers of the whole project. And I was at that point the source of the principal funding to that point for the whole project. So how that came to pass was my own organization, South Lake CFDC, had done a community strategic plan to sort of drive our community economic development work over the next 3 to 4 years. And one thing that was clearly identified in all that was the need to bring some form of post-secondary education to the area. At the time, although school board did not like you to say 50% of the kids dropped out, because technically you had to sign a paper to drop out, and they didn't all sign the paper. First sign of trouble, well, I might as well quit now and beat my friends to the front of the line to flip burgers at McDonald's because I'm not going anywhere anyway. I can't go past grade 12, and I don't have the resources to go away to go to school or whatever, right? So there was real impediments to that sort of thing. So we thought that was an important thing. About that same time, Jerry was doing his focus group work on what's wrong with the Georgina Education Center. So I went to one of his focus groups, didn't identify myself, just went, participated, heard a lot of people saying the same things, and a lot of people thinking that there's need for trade stuff, and I didn't disagree with all that given the culture of the area. And so then Jerry's report came out, and at that point, he started on his little mission. And one of the first people he got in touch with was a woman named Ann Pegg. And Ann was on my board. I had recruited Ann onto my board a couple years before because of all her work with the Trillium Foundation and whatever. So that was fine. And he approached Ann about getting involved in some kind of project. And she said, well, you should go and see Peter Budreo. And then she gave me a heads up I was going to get a call from Jerry Brower. I knew it was going to be about. So he gave me a call. He booked an appointment. He came in. We sat down in my meeting room. And I had with me a copy of my strategic plan and also a program I had just been initiated through the federal government that was bringing about $600,000 of rural ec dev money to our community every year, managed by my organization. So Jerry was doing his song and dance. I said, I'm going to stop you right now. I showed him my plan. I showed him this information on this funding I had. And I said, we have the resources to start making this happen. So let's start this thing up. And very quickly, a steering committee came together. For the entire first year, they always met in my organization's boardroom. We just made it available to them for the meetings. And we also put together funding for a couple of consultants to do a little pre-study to make sure it was a feasibility thing, and it was. And then based on that, a bigger whack of money to fund the full first year operational plan and corporation documents, that whole original business planning thing that got it up and going and went after its first funding from the provincial government for a program delivery. So through all that process, I ended up being asked to see if I would be one of the signatories to the incorporation documents and became a founding board member.
So what do you think was the greatest asset that you brought to the board of directors?
My financial and acumen, I guess, and my management experience. We ended up with an executive director pretty early on. It was a secondment from the school boards. Art was amazing. Art was a real believer. Art had been on the steering committee as well, right? So he was a perfect person for that role. He had lots of connections, but Art had never managed anything in his life.
Right.
So in many respects, I was sort of always behind Art saying, you got to do this. This is how you do minutes. I ended up doing the minutes, all that kind of stuff. I took care of a lot of those sorts of things, including until I hired their first administrator, who was Jennifer. I, for the first year on the side, kept the books. Looking back on it, the one thing I really thought I did was there was a very dark moment about 4 years into the project when the two school board representatives announced that after that year, they would no longer be able to fund the executive director. And then all of a sudden there was this fairly large salary hole in the budget. And a lot of people think, well, that's the end of it. We can't go on. We can't, and that was a lot of the talk. We can't go on. And I'm thinking, well, we can go on. It just takes a different approach. we can do anything we want as long as we have a business plan to achieve it with set objectives and so forth and so on. So basically, I sold them that night on the prospect of actually putting together a real business plan, and then led that project. And we developed a business plan and identified places where we could develop margin on projects and create, margin that would offset the admin costs. It sort of put together a bit of a package from that point of view. And, that was, as I said, that was about 4 years into it. So where we have 11 years down the road, something has worked.
So as the general manager of South Lake Community Futures, what really motivated you to choose to fund GTTI beyond the educational post-secondary mandate?
It was just the synergies of what we were doing, right? Our own strat plan said we needed to have something. And this was the vehicle to start making it happen, right? So that was that was the biggest thing. And it was good for the community. It really hit our community economic development targets and objectives. And from the point of view of all the work we did in CED across Georgina in particular, we worked in Georgina, East Glenbury, and Brock Township. But if I just look at the stuff we did in Georgina, the three biggest things we ever got involved with were GTTI, the broadband, and the Ontario Water Center, which is Clearwater Farm, right? And, they were all things that had potential to change the game as far as how business could operate in the area, what the opportunities were for things to happen that were, more knowledge-based or whatever, right? And just generally raise the overall education level and understanding of the overall area, right? And try to hopefully change some of the perceptions of it.
If someone in another rural town was trying to duplicate what's been done here at GTTI, where do you think that they should start?
Well, I've actually made this presentation. Years ago, I had to speak at a provincial conference for the OACF, the Ontario Association of Community Futures. And it was about sort of big projects you'd done. And so the three I spoke to in specifically were the three I've just mentioned in my previous answer. And the one that attracted the absolute most attention from people after the fact, people coming up to me through the course of the rest of the conference to try to get input, was the GTTI. You need certain things. You need to have the first thing you need to have is someone in a community to be a champion. So we had a champion. We had Jerry, right? And this presentation was all about igniting things. And I alluded to starting CED projects to like trying to start a campfire in the bush on a rainy day. And all the stuff you had to do in advance before you ever thought you would try a match on it, right? You wanted to make sure you were all ready to go because you might only get one chance to get something to burn, and you had to have everything else ready to go to build that fire to the point where it had enough critical heat that you couldn't put it out easily, or the rain couldn't put it out, right? So it was funny because I'd gone through this experience on a canoe trip just recently, and this presentation was what they call a 20 by 20 presentation. You're allowed 20 slides and 20 seconds per slide. So as I say, I got into the whole thing. The thing I was talking about, you had to have all your pieces together. You had to have a champion, and you had to find the right community partners. And for GTTI, I said, well, hey, there are a lot of issues. There was a whole education issue. So right off the top, the school board wanted to help to solve that because that was kind of like not reflecting well on them. There was another issue for the town because they had this building they had bought for a medical center that now wasn't going to be a medical center and was sitting there vacant and was creating a lot of, bad feeling about what they're doing with it. So here was a solution to put it to a positive use, right? We had this need to have post-secondary education. A lot of things came together that said, yeah, we can make a partnership. And that's what it was, sort of how you did it. And that's why I said that's what you have to find. You have to find the community champion. It's going to take work. And you've got to find the right partners who all can see a reason why they want to be involved with this.
Would you say that GTTI has lived up to the original vision 15 years down the line?
Oh, it has surpassed, especially now with where it's going with this whole new provincial training center. I was on the initial steering group for that in the early stage, but that was also as I was getting off the board. So I was involved with that for about the first 6 months of that project when Bill first sort of got involved. I think it has more than exceeded my expectations. I couldn't be happy with them with where the place is these days.
Across the 15 years that GTTI has been in operation, over 10,000 people have gone through training there. Do you remember any sort of moment where you felt like you were really making an impact?
Well, even the first kids, right? The very first kids. I remember Art telling stories. Ironically, the very first kind of intern we had to help Art with the delivery of the program was a fellow who was an older adult, not older adult like my age, but he was in his mid 40s, and he was making a career change from owning a machine shop business to becoming a shop teacher. And I happen to know the guy because he was a scout leader in Mount Albert as well. All of a sudden, he's there at the GTTI, and he's their intern for like 3 or 4 months, and he was helping Art to control the class and whatever. Because a lot of people, when that very first class, these kids hadn't been in a classroom in a long time. They really had no idea exactly what the expectations were. So Paul was there to assist with that. But all the stories I would hear about how kids came in, and the first day they were like, "Oh my God, I'm not sure this kid's going to last a week," to all of a sudden, 3 weeks later, some kid's still there, he survived, and then some light goes on and go, "Oh, now I get it," and then becoming, a good student in the program. So even one story like that from the very first class made me feel good, right? But there's been hundreds of stories like that, maybe more for all I know, right?
Yeah.
And all you do is, when I was on the board, I was often over there for meetings of the finance committee or whatever. There's always stuff going on. You'd walk in, there was just such a buzz to the place, and I never heard a negative buzz in there.